All right, welcome back. This is part 2 of the fraud series. Max is still with me. We were talking about if banking doesn't work out, we might start our own fraud business. Who knows? So just so you guys know, that might happen. All right, let's dive back in. So how can consumers help monitor fraud or look out for fraud? Yeah. And is there a way besides just the debit card alerts? Because that just seems like a kind of obvious blanket one.
I mean, the biggest thing is limiting where you're using your card. And that's not saying, don't use your card, don't swipe it, but kind of being smart or doing a little look into where you're purchasing, where you're entering in those card details. I know there's been businesses before that have had issues with you think you're on a retail store's kind of storefront. It's a trusted retailer, but really the transaction is going through a marketplace. That marketplace is who knows where, who knows if they actually have the products to
send
to you.
How would somebody know that, though?
A lot of times, basically, the businesses have gotten a lot of pressure because they get disputes, they get angry customer calls, things like that, where now a lot of times it'll say marketplace. I know Amazon will say it's fulfilled by Amazon but sold by a different retailer.
Okay.
Other retailers will have that too, where it's kind of easy to identify. Depends on the website. Not all retailers do it, nor are they obligated to, but it can kind of help sense where, those transactions are actually getting routed to, where those products are getting shipped from, and who you're actually buying it from. Part of that, too, is if you ever do have a dispute, knowing sometimes that if you were to go out to that retailer, they can't actually help you with the dispute. You have to take it up with that marketplace. And that's not to say that those marketplace owners are unscrupulous, that they're out there. A lot of those are, the mom and pop little craft shops, things like that you might see on different retailer sites. But it is something to kind of scrutinize a little bit more and kind of understand who you're dealing with on a transaction. The biggest thing, obviously, it's not 100% foolproof, but to look at the reviews if you are dealing with a non-prominent retailer, and look at the reviews and see, Google reviews, other storefront reviews, things like that to see, I got my product on time.
Yeah.
I had an issue with the return and they helped me out. Things like that aren't always foolproof, but they give a better idea on I'm dealing with probably a trusted retailer and someone that I feel a little bit more comfortable entering in my information with.
Yeah. Couple questions before I forget these. Debit card versus credit card. Swiping versus tapping. Because I love a good tap. Or Apple Pay or whatever, those. And then I had one more, but maybe just touch on those and I'll think of the third.
Yeah, so credit cards and debit cards for a consumer are protected very much the same way.
Okay.
They have very similar dispute processes. Obviously, it could be vary a little bit if you're talking, MasterCard versus American Express versus Visa, the actual process, but there are protections in place. Really, it comes down to customer choice. So one of the things you might look at is if I did have debit card fraud on my account, there is a process. You're going to contact the bank, work through that, file that dispute paperwork. But in the meantime, I have utility bills to pay. I have my rent to pay, and that money's out of my account immediately, but it might take me a couple of days. Does a check bounce in between? Does a payment not go through because I need it? Where, a credit card, it's that money isn't really charged until that end of the statement cycle.
Yeah.
So sometimes customers will opt to use credit cards when they're doing those online payments, but they are protected in the same way. It just kind of comes up to customer choice on that.
Okay. What about tap versus swipe?
Tap versus swipe. So really, for most places, the retailers have really gotten on board. Merchant companies, processing companies have gotten on board by saying you're going to pay really high card acceptance rates if people are swiping. So you're seeing those chip cards. That's not to say chip cards can't be duplicated, can't be, manufactured to commit fraud, but it is a little bit different. The swiping cards, those can be replicated very easily.
Oh.
And those terminals. Tapping is...
Why did tapping ever happen?
So really what tapping is... So the funny thing about this is, so a lot of people heard EMV chip card. Well, EMV is Euro, MasterCard, Visa. hate to say it, but in the United States, we usually lag about 5 to 7 years behind our counterparts in Europe on combating fraud. They're really on top of things. Part of it is how they have certain laws set up in their banking world. That's a whole other story. But they started the EMV cards. Well, what happened is it reduced a lot of fraud from card, the mag stripe, the swiping, but fraudsters catch up.
Yeah.
So one of the things they looked at was encrypting payments. So when you're having those contactless payments, it's a tokenized transaction. So it's a different, basically, payment string each time. It's not your full card information being used. So the other thing we look at too is, we talk about things in the online bank world, securing your account's password, things like that, is when you're tapping, using your phone, you're never really releasing that card. So restaurants, you'll see a lot more using handheld terminals that the waiter or waitress will
I'm
bring
married
to
to
you.
a Canadian.
Yep.
They only do that in Canada. I remember the first time I went there, I was like, what is that thing? And Brendan's like, that's all they do is they don't take your card away from you.
Yep. And part of really what that is it's a security thing.
For
We
sure.
saw,
Yeah.
it was probably the early 2010, 2011. There were actually cases of waiters at very fancy steak restaurants concealing a card skimmer behind their tie. And of course, you take your, card, they take it back, and they were swiping it
Yep.
once to store that information and then swiping it
Yeah.
for the actual transaction. And that's not saying that waiters or waitresses, are doing that. They're
Yeah.
fraudsters, but it is something that has happened. So usually it's an ease of use thing for contactless payments, but a lot of it is I know where I'm scanning that card. It's a convenience thing, but it's also my payment's never leaving my hands. I'm not handing it to
Yep.
someone. That transaction's there. Also helps too when you're reconciling your account, whether that be daily, every other day. It's kind of easier to remember I'm looking at that account and I remember taking my phone out or tapping my card somewhere.
Yeah. Okay, 2 questions that are in my head right now. One, sometimes I get the option to, I'm thinking about Venmo, and I can either pay from my credit card or I can pay from my bank account. But I don't get charged a certain percentage. I'm like, well, I don't want to get charged a certain percentage.
Yep.
So I enter my bank account info.
Yeah.
Is that riskier?
There are some scams out there with Venmo requests, Cash App, Zelle, PayPal, those type of things. Really, my best advice is when you're using one of those payment apps is to basically treat it like cash. If I hand you $100 and you take it and say, I'm paying you back or I'm paying you for something, that $100 is gone. I have no mechanism to pull it back. Try and think of those Venmo payments or, Zelle, Cash App as just like handing cash over. So only conduct those transactions with people sometimes that is tricky. I do know retailers sometimes have that option now, especially some of those, small craft retailers. This time of year, the holidays, people pay that way. There are some risks. There are ways to protect that. I do know people will have a separate bank account just for their Venmo transactions if they are, handling things they're doing. Maybe they're running a small business, things like that, or
Yeah.
even we've seen it where kids are, doing lawn mowing, things like that, odd jobs. They'll have a separate account for that just to kind
The
of
lemonade
isolate
stand,
that.
and now they have Venmo codes.
Yep, absolutely.
Or QR codes to their Venmo.
It just makes it easier to pay.
Okay, but is attaching my payment system to my bank account versus my credit card, am I putting myself more at risk?
There's a slight amount of risk there just because, of course,
It's direct access to
Yep,
it.
direct access to there versus a card thing. And again, that's that kind of weighing the security versus convenience. So, you're going to be maybe more secure with your credit card, but really the convenience is the cost of that extra percentage fee versus your bank account. Again, monitoring those is really the biggest key on combating that fraud.
Yeah. Okay, so in the last one we talked about people and their phishing polls going into mailboxes or whatever. Would you recommend businesses to try to cut back on the amount of checks that they're mailing out?
Yep, certainly. The more they can do things electronically, the better. One, it's easier to confirm payments are being received. Usually, a wire is typically same day, depends on, the banks involved in the transaction. ACHs can be same day or next day, but really it can help secure those payments and kind of lock down when things are. Checks, like I said, it's very hard. Post office times are much longer than they used to be. And sometimes, you might pay that check. It's not even that it's fraud, but it truly got lost in the system.
Yeah.
So those are some of the things. Sometimes, businesses favor the checks. They like the way it works, but the more you can shift into that electronic space, really it helps on confirming payments went to where they're supposed to go. It helps really deal with businesses because they can confirm receipts. And sometimes, depending on the business or industry, it can actually make things go a lot better because they can release shipments quicker. They can send the next shipment on quicker versus waiting for a check in the mail.
Yeah, I feel like some businesses might use checks because they think that they're more secure.
Yep.
Like, I'm not going to pay somebody like online with my bank account, but really that's not quite the case anymore because people are using phishing pools to fish out checks. So how does the bank monitor fraud? Like, do we have somebody who looks at business transactions and is like, oh, that seems out of the norm? Or how would we ever catch something like that?
Yeah, so we have a couple different systems in place. Like I've mentioned before, the debit card transaction alerting. That's a very system that almost every bank, credit union,
and
credit
we
card.
have that. That's not on
Correct.
them to set up.
Nope. And it will look at those transactions.
Is it based on location?
Location, it can look at a lot of factors where typical transactions that you're doing, things like that. So a lot of times when a customer, either the transaction, maybe it goes through, but it'll get flagged for review as, say, I only use my debit card for going to get gas at the local gas station. So
Yeah.
$50, maybe even more nowadays, depending on how big your tank is. But all of a sudden I do a transaction that usually I do on my credit card, but maybe I have, for instance, an American Express and they don't accept it at a restaurant. So I put a $300 transaction on.
Yeah.
Well, the system's in play. It's all automated, and it looks at kind of a bevy of data points. And what it'll look at is, that's a little unusual, or that maybe in that case it's very unusual, but we're going to let one transaction go through. The second one, if you don't respond in time, might get blocked because now I have two suspected transactions in play. But it does look at that widespread thing. So it's not going to necessarily block your card if it's in your range of transactions you usually do. But it does look at things like location. That's where it's always good to let your bank know when you're traveling, when you might be making an unexpected high purchase, even if it's within your limits. On a debit card, it still might flag because you usually only use them for a lower dollar amount.
Yeah. What about on the business side?
Same thing with debit cards, but we also kind of bank-wide, business and consumer. We do have some monitoring systems for ACH and check transactions. They do work in very much the same way as that debit card monitoring. So basically building out those things. So for instance, looking at typical debits out of your account and flagging ones that are a high dollar amount or potentially a new debitor with a higher dollar amount. It also monitors for certain things of debits or credits, things like that, coming in different people's names. Sometimes someone might go just M Florestano for me instead of Max Florestano. Obviously, that's probably a legitimate transaction, but that could flag in the system for a quick review. And a lot of this, the customer's never even going to know we're kind of doing in the background until it comes to a potentially fraudulent transaction, which again, we work with the customer to identify. Sometimes it's things of, a check and a really old check coming through and they just grabbed the wrong checkbook, or, a husband or wife didn't realize they were paying the same person twice, things like that.
Yeah.
But we do work with the customer to try and identify those transactions, but it's, again, automated things looking at basically those abnormalities in the system.
Do you like the topic of fraud?
I do.
You just seem so knowledgeable about it all.
Yep.
Have we always had a fraud person at the bank?
We've always had people that have worked in the fraud space, But really what we looked at, so this department, our fraud department, kind of my role and some people on my team's role, kind of evolved out of needing to watch fraud more, looking at tools that in the future we can monitor things in real time. Faster payments is a thing that's coming on the horizon where instant credits and debits into out of accounts, it's going to be, more sets of eyes on it. So we've always had people working on it, but really it's an investment on the bank side to have more staff looking on it, more hands on the products that are evaluating what could be fraudulent or not, and really to help our customers out. Like I said, we want our customers, they're kind of our first line of defense because they know the transactions they're conducting and they can help us out a lot, but we want to be able to help our customers out because even if we stop fraud and money never leaves the account, having to open a new account, having to get a new debit card in the mail. I mean, switching automated, subscriptions, things like that. Heck, even your Netflix payment every month is an inconvenience. So we want to have enough systems out there that help our customers, help us stay on the cutting edge as a bank, but also protect our customers as well.
And I know that you go out to businesses and will do presentations like this, like fraud presentations. Yep. So if you are a business and you do want a little bit more information, definitely reach out to Max. I just want to end on 3 tips or advice or what's in your brain or what's in your mind when it comes to fraud that you just want people to know.
Well, I think one is checking your accounts. Again, I keep hitting on that topic, but that is the quickest way to identify something's going on. It might even limit that amount of work you have to do. If you do have to close accounts or get a new debit card, it might even help you be prepared to kind of figure out what accounts you have. One of the biggest tips is kind of keep track of things that you do have recurring. So if you do ever have debit card fraud, you can get those switched because no one wants to deal with, and it could be something as simple as Netflix, but it could be something like an internet bill, a utility bill, something more serious where you don't want to have a service shut off or get a late fee, things like that. So monitoring accounts is the biggest one. The other one is
often?
I would say as much as you can daily, pretty much daily as a good rule of thumb. Again, depends on if you use your account a lot, but every day or two, I would say. I know people check them sometimes hourly. I'm not saying you have to do that.
I'm going to make this my New Year's resolution to check my account every day. So don't hack me because I'm going to be checking.
Yep. But, as least as you're doing it daily, you'll probably have a good idea of, hey, I stopped at the grocery store. I went to the gas station, things like that. The second one would be looking at who you're doing business with. So, knowing, again, those marketplaces, things like that, where your card information is out there, and also entering in your information certain places. I'm guilty of it. Any website I'll go to, I'll sign up for their rewards program.
Especially you get 15% off.
Absolutely.
I'm like, here's my info.
Yep. But one of the things, too, this is the easiest trick to do that, to kind of limit some of that information, is set up a second email address just for those rewards things. Not saying those are what always get breached, but even having that email sorted somewhere else can kind of help you out, flag those things. And again, it kind of isolates that information.
Yeah.
And then too, looking at businesses you work with, things like that in your information, checks aren't inherently bad, but looking at your payment sources. So utilizing a mix of those, but kind of keeping track of your checks. I can say this, I'm probably kind of guilty of it. I don't always know where my checkbook is. I don't really use it anymore. But that's the thing, is knowing where those things are, securing documents.
Yeah.
Really, that's the biggest thing, is securing your data is my kind of final tip, is because all that data around there kind of can start to compile. And your card information might already be out there, but because they don't have kind of all those other data points,
other missing pieces,
they can't bring it together. But if you can secure that data, one of the easiest things to protect is get enrolled in e-statements, whether that's your banking, utility, things like that.
So it's not in the mail.
Absolutely. Yeah. And if you do, I totally understand why people do still like to get paper copies of things, but go on Amazon, go to Target, Walmart, and get a shredder, because I have heard it. I've seen it. I've seen evidence of it. People do dumpster dive and pull that information.
Yep.
Again, that's one of those physical means, but they will get your information that way.
Got it. Check your accounts.
Know who you're doing work with.
Know who you're doing work with.
And then also just securing your data kind
Yeah.
of holistically.
I love the one about the email.
Yep.
Oh, that's such a good idea. That's such a good idea. This has been great. This is like, I mean, like my mind is swimming. It's a lot to take in. But I think it's just, you know, the more you know,
Absolutely.
the better. And it's likely not going to decrease. So
Yep.
I think it's, yeah. So if we just have to stay very diligent and very up to date on it, and also having a financial institution that is up to date on it and has your back is,
Absolutely.
you know, just another layer of defense. So that's really great.
And I will say, when in doubt, contact us. You know, we're
Yeah.
more than happy to help. We've seen a lot of things. We've seen a lot of scams. We've seen a lot of attempts. And, you know, sometimes it's a very legitimate email, payment requests, things like that. But, you know, obviously it's not always that case, and we can
Yeah.
help out too. So when in doubt, you know, slow the transaction down.
Yeah.
Get help. Get, you know, look, as much as it sounds kind of counterintuitive, Google it to see, you know, is this a legitimate transaction?
Yeah.
But contact your bank when in doubt.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much for joining
Absolutely.
me. Thank you, everybody. And again, if you did not watch part 1, tons of good information there as well. So fraud part 1, part 2, check. Thank you.